For the first session this morning, Simon Caney from Oxford University will speak on justice, trusteeship, and the transition to a low-carbon society. Simon.
Thank you. Thank you for coming here. Thank you for the invitation. What I want to do is to talk about four elements that I think are a crucial part of the transition to a low-carbon society. And I'm going to say probably most about the third one, but all of them I think are necessary. So I think there are four elements that should guide us in our thought to moving to a low-carbon world. One is what normative principles should guide us. The second one is what policies should be adopted to realize those principles. And I find often people then stop and they have some principles of justice and they have some preferred policies and they say, let's do it. But my third one is we really need politics. We need an account of ways of designing political institutions so that they are more likely to enact the right principles and policies. So that's part three. And then part four is I think we need to have a wider view. We need to have a wider view and have a different vocabulary, a different kind of political language to talk about the challenge. So those three preceding ones are not enough. So I'm going to be quite brief on the first part. If we're moving towards a low-carbon world, I think there are two core principles. And the first is kind of obvious, but it should be said. We should be, one of the principles is that we should avoid dangerous anthropogenic climate change. Now, of course, the word dangerous can be interpreted in lots of ways, and I want to define it in ways that concern the protection of core human interests and rights. And I use the language of capabilities from Amartya Sen and Martha Nussbaum. People often then say, well, we should do whatever it takes to avoid dangerous climate change. And I don't think that's at all right. I think we also need to have a just share of any burdens and benefits in the transition to a low-carbon world. And so that's where principle 2 comes in, that with respect to mitigation, adaptation, and compensation, the burdens have to be shared equitably. Now, you might think, what does this mean? So let me say a little bit more about just burden sharing and focus particularly on energy. What this means is that if we have carbon taxes or regulations or emissions trading or some other scheme, it's vital that we still respect people's interest in energy, because energy is vital for so many core human functionings. And the second thing I want to say about just burden sharing is that very many people, I think, get it on the wrong footing, because they define it in terms of sharing out rights to emit greenhouse gases. That's a kind of fetishism. We, of course, have to limit greenhouse gases, but what matters are the enjoyment of capabilities. And it just turns out that it's a byproduct of things like agriculture and energy use that certain modes of serving those capabilities have these harmful effects. But the things that matter to us are things like food, water, education, mobility. So I don't care if my next door neighbor has 3 times as many emissions as I do, but I probably do care if they have greater opportunities to enjoy their core interests. So this is going to be relevant for the policy, because the policy is to move away from focusing on emissions. Okay, what kind of energy regime should we be aiming for? Well, there are other people here who know a lot more about energy than I do, but looking at it as a political philosopher, I would say we need to ensure there's universal access for all people now and in the future to energy. Since we have only a limited amount of greenhouse gases, we have less than 500 billion to emit at the very most, that means we have to think about other sources of energy. So we want universal access, we want reasonable cost, we don't want them to have harmful side effects, and many alternative energy sources, for example, first-generation biofuels, they often have harmful side effects, whether it's leading to spikes in food prices or land grabs or malign health impacts. Fourthly, we want it to be reliable, by which I mean that I'm thinking of things like solar or wind. We want to have a secure, stable supply. And we want it to be storable. And then the final thing I could think of is we want non-domination, or we want a kind of security in that we're not at the beck and call of someone else. So we're not dependent on other people who are sort of unilaterally not dependent on us. I don't mind us being mutually interdependent, but I do mind one-sided dependence. So it seems like an energy regime, we don't want it so that some are at the thrall of others. One other aspect of just burden sharing is we want a transition that respects people's interests in employment. And this tends, I think, to get left out of the picture, that people will be losing jobs. And you could think there's nothing special about having a job, but when I looked at the psychological literature, very many people's self-esteem is tied in with performing tasks, having a job. And so any just transition has to find ways of ensuring that people's interest in work and labour is protected. Some people I present to say, no, they just want leisure all the time, but there are many others of whom that's not the case. So if those are the two guiding principles, right, one is about just burden sharing and the other one is about preventing the harmful climate change, what policies? I want to flag up something that's been intimated by Thomas Pogge, and it's grounded in work that he and others have done on medicines, where there's a global disease burden. There are diseases which people in poor countries suffer, and pharmaceutical companies do not respond to this because they don't have effective demand. They don't have the purchasing power. So there's a lot of innovation on the illnesses of wealthy people, but not on the poor. And so Pogge and others, I've listed a whole tranche of them here, say, well, why can't we have a scheme which would incentivize entrepreneurs to produce medicines for the global disease burden? And people would be rewarded to the extent that they devise medicines that are actually diffused and shared amongst the global poor. So it's not enough just to create the medicine and have it kept by yourself. You get, on this scheme, you get rewarded for producing medicines that are actually then used in developing countries beneficially. I think we need something like this for energy and climate change because we have a pressing need for clean energy and not enough is being produced. So let me set out the background assumptions. One is we have a justified demand. We have 1.8 billion people who lack access to electricity. Second is we have a limit on greenhouse gases. Here's something from Dave Frame and his colleagues, but then it's in the IPCC reports. We have a budget, humanity, of at the very most 1 trillion tons of carbon, of which we've already used up more than half. And at the current rate of usage, we'll use up the rest of that by 2039. If you go to climateprediction.net, you'll see this in action where it'll predict with spurious accuracy, like 3 p.m. on May the 15th, 2039. But the point is we have this finite source. So we have justified demands, we have a limit on the budget, and it seems very likely to me that we have more demand and more justified demand than we have supply. So there are 2 points here. It's not clear to me, especially if you bear in mind the interests of future generations, that we have enough clean energy, even if people reduce their consumption, even if people like you and I reduce consumption. But the second thing is, and just being realistic, very many people are not going to reduce their consumption. Britain, the country I live in, is apparently the 5th wealthiest economy in the world, and most of its citizens think that they're leading a terribly difficult, arduous life, and the idea of telling people to reduce consumption would seem unacceptable, maybe just obscene to some people. So I'm just going to take that as a given, that many people just won't reduce consumption, and given their non-compliance, what should we do? Well, then the fourth thing is, we have an intellectual property regime for the use of energy, And it affects, it's not a given, right? We can change it, and it affects the extent of innovation. It affects the degree to which energy is distributed equitably. So since it's not a given, and since we have this pressing need, shouldn't we try and design it in ways to realize the best outcomes? Now, some responses to likely pushback. So Stanley Jevons, writing in the 19th century, came up with the concept of a rebound effect, that when you increase energy efficiency, people's consumption goes up. So at this point, I always think of dieting products, that when you have lower fat food, people often just consume more of it. And so there's no net reduction, or no net gain there. Now, this is a serious problem, but when I looked at the IPCC report, it said, the extent to which there's a rebound effect, it doesn't wipe out the total benefits of energy efficiency. But the salient point, and this comes out in the IPCC reports, is that the rebound effect would be worrying if it wasn't accompanied by other measures. So it would be worrying if there were increases in energy efficiency, and that's all we did. But if they're accompanied by policies which try and tackle demand and reduce consumption to some degree, then you don't have this effect of having more energy efficiency just captured then with more consumption. So that's a policy proposal. I'm not a policy expert, but you can see the reasoning I'm trying to give for you. We have these justified demands. We have a limited energy source. The existing energy ones often have very malign side effects. Think of displacement with the use of dams. Think about first-generation biofuels and their side effects. Think about nuclear. So there seems to be a pressing demand to generate new clean energy, and it seems to me that we can't ignore the intellectual property regime to do that. How long have I been going? Just barely started, right? Okay. Now, I've said something about principles. I've said something about policy. I should say about the policy, I'm not saying this is the only policy, of course. I'm not commenting on many other things like carbon taxes, trading systems, regulations, RED, and so forth. But the reason I proposed that policy was to do with the need for energy. But I want to now talk about the political context, or the political framework. And if I could make a general point about the way that climate change is discussed, I see a sort of 2 or 3 waves. So initially, scientists wrote a lot about this, and that's reflected in the IPCC reports. And then economists talk about it, and they come up with all kinds of economic policies, optimal design, and political philosophers and moral philosophers, such as myself, have worked on it. But I think there's a kind of there's an apolitical character to all of those preceding discourses, which is, well, I've given you some principles, and here's a policy. I think it's jolly good. Let it happen. And we can't just do that. We need to think about the politics of it. And political science has been somewhat laggardly, I think, in thinking about the political structures that are most likely to bring about sort of a clean energy transition. Now, because of sort of limits of time, I didn't say anything about the global level. And of course, the global level is crucial. But I wanted to say something about ways we might rethink domestic political institutions to make them more receptive to thinking about the transition to a low-carbon world. And the criteria I have in mind are, can we think of things which are effective, which might make some difference? It doesn't mean they solve the problem, but can they make some difference? Can they do it in a morally legitimate way? So no eco-authoritarianism. And can they do it where we can get from here to there? So are they accessible from where we are? And fourthly, are they feasible in that, are they self-sustaining over time, or not going to survive? So think of those 4 criteria. Effectiveness, moral legitimacy, accessibility from here, and feasibility, meaning political sustainability. what I want to sketch is some thoughts about reforming political institutions that I hope meet those 4 criteria. But let me just backtrack and say, well, why should we think about the future, and then talk about how? So, obviously one reason to think about the future impacts of climate change is our moral responsibilities to future generations. However you define those, climate change is going to contravene the standard principles affirmed. And we have a problem with climate change for 2 reasons, I think, which are distinct. One is the fact that the emission of a greenhouse gas, once it's up there, it stays for 100 years, for 1,000 years. I think 10% stay up there for 100,000 years. So we have to think about the temporally extended nature of emissions. And the second feature is lock-in, namely that decisions we make now about urban infrastructure, buildings, houses, energy systems, they have a stickiness, or as political scientists call it, they have a path dependence. And decisions we make now will lock in the next generation and the generation after that. So, rule 1 of PowerPoint, never have lots of text. But I've highlighted the salient bit, which is the summary for policymakers. Makes very clear about how infrastructure and long-lived products lock societies in. And what this means is you can't just do something at T1 and then think, oh, well, if that doesn't work out, we'll just change our minds at T2 and change what we've put in place. And that's particularly true, as it says there, of infrastructure and spatial planning. Yeah, I guess, urban forms, infrastructure, housing. So we have to take the long view. Reforming energy for transition to a low-carbon world. And it would not be a problem if we were not myopic and always thought about the long term and we had good knowledge. But, we have these tendencies for myopia. There are very many reasons. I don't want you to think of this, I just like the quotation from Hobbes, but there are very many reasons why human beings aren't very good about thinking about the long term. It might be weakness of will. It might be we just don't care about those people. It might be that we only respond well to concrete, experienced information, not abstract general models. It might be, I know that we procrastinate, vice alien to myself. So there are all kinds of reasons. So friends who know me all know that's not true. There are all kinds of reasons we're not very good at dealing with long-term problems. So how do we respond to this? How do we deal with the fact that we're having this imprint on the future, but we have a tendency to be short-sighted? Here are some things that people have tried or do put a lot of stock in. Constitutional entrenchment. So these countries, in their constitution, you will find a constitutional commitment to the rights of future generations, or to intergenerational equity, or preserving the natural world. I'm skeptical about how much this materially makes a difference, but it can make a difference. But one thing I would ask is, it's great if you've got that in there, but how did you get it in the first place? There's a kind of a first mover problem about how do you get politicians sufficiently interested in it to pass such things in the first place? Yeah. Other places, Hungary has a deputy ombudsman for future generations whose role is to explore concerns, to report, to investigate complaints. But again, what his role is, and it's Marcel Szabo at the moment, is constrained by the nature of the laws that are currently in place. And so his role is to find discrepancies between the law and practice. And if there are power plants being built that contravene the law, then he can do something. But if that's not happening, then there's not so much that he can do. Malta has a similar model, has a guardian for future generations. Israel had its commission which reported to the Knesset, but it was abolished after 5 years. Wales had a commissioner for sustainable futures until earlier this year, Peter Davis, and then that was converted to a future generations commissioner. Yeah, I put down a couple of other things that people mention. Andy Dobson, Christian Eckerly, Philip Van Parijs talk about changing the voting systems, giving plural votes to people with children, or making voting mandatory for younger people, or having age-relevant quotas so that there must be a certain number of MPs below a certain age. Again, those are going to be quite short-term, right? Those are going to pick up problems that come with education and pension reform and things that will hit in the next 5, 10 years. If you're thinking about 1,000 years, they're not going to respond that well. I'll mention 2 others before moving on to what I think we should do. So litigation, I mentioned this briefly yesterday, actually, that the Netherlands case of Urgenda. But those of you who've watched the news last night or this morning will have heard that the Dutch government is contesting that. And then sometimes, especially economists, are often keen on creating institutions which are insulated from the political process. So they will say politicians are myopic and citizens are myopic, but bureaucrats can take the long view. And so some people favour independent central banks for this reason. Some people endorse, Australia has a future fund whose role was to ensure there's money to pay for the pensions of public sector workers, I think. Jérémy can tell me if I get that wrong. But these are very localized and specific things, right? So I want to suggest we ought to do other things. So think about why people ignore the future. They ignore it because they have to confront with the news in the newspaper, because out of sight means out of mind, because things that are invisible, like the future, are things you can just ignore. You can't ignore it if there's a scandal in the newspaper. You can't ignore it if inflation goes up and journalists are asking you what you're doing about it. But the future doesn't have these features. So one of my proposals is that if we're very serious about climate change and energy, then we should have a mandatory requirement on governments that they issue a vision for the future, and they specify what they are going to do about future challenges and opportunities. Now, there is something a little bit like this in Finland, but mine is crucially different. So in the Finnish system, the government chooses a topic, and it says, this is what we're going to do about it in the future. But mine is that we have an independent council for the future that has projections and trends about demographic change, pension reform, welfare state provision, energy use, climate change, geopolitics. And it highlights these, and then it says to the incoming government, you must write a statement saying how you're going to respond to this, what your goals are, how you're going to do it. And the point there is to make it visible and concrete as something it has to address. It can't ignore it. It can't say it's not something we need to think about now. And then the second element is we should have like a State of the Union speech for the future, where the government is to present this manifesto for the future. It's a clean energy regime. In Parliament, when it's debated and discussed, and others can press them and say, so what are you going to do about X? But your proposal for dealing with Y isn't properly costed. So it's an idea of deliberative democracy where those in power are required to justify what they're doing. Now, they don't have to be saints, right? They just have to have a willingness not to be humiliated, embarrassed by saying, oh, well, I've got nothing to say to that. Now, it can be gamed, because, of course, people can say, oh, look, the best thing for the future is just to concentrate on the present. But remember, my criterion of effectiveness is not, does it solve the problem? Does it eradicate it? Is, does it make a difference from the status quo? And my wager is, it makes a positive difference. It's much harder to ignore the future when you're being quizzed on it and pressed on it, and you don't want to look incompetent by not having a properly thought-through response to it. I also think this should be accompanied by sort of a national deliberation day, or where workplaces, schools, local communities similarly engage in this debate. In fact, in the Welsh Future Generations Bill, which came into effect in April this year, that was inaugurated by what they called national conversations about the future of Wales. And one of their ideas is in the future, the year before an election in Wales, they will have these similar public debates. So they make the topics visible, they make people think about it, so that they don't just disappear under the agenda of today. Well, they make the future part of the agenda of today. That's the pitch. Third thing, you need parliamentary scrutiny. So people often do reach for extra parliamentary powers, but I'm a Democrat, and I want politicians to make these decisions. Now, Finland has a committee for the future. As of 1993, and in 2000 it was made permanent. But theirs is quite a restricted role. It is to advise the opposition on how to respond to the government. But it's not a select committee. It doesn't have scrutiny powers over all legislation. But think about climate change. It seeps through so many issues. It seeps through anything that has anything to do with energy use. And of course agriculture. So the proposal here then is you have a select committee which can compel civil servants and politicians to be accountable for what they're doing and what plans they're putting in place. And think, for example, about procrastination. The philosophical and psychological literature on procrastination says that one feature of it is people genuinely wanting to do something, but they don't put the plans into place. They don't map it out as to what days they're going to do things. But if you're being quizzed about it, if you have to stand up in Parliament and you're being asked what you have done with respect to X, that gives you a purely self-interested politician or civil servant. It gives you a very strong incentive to have a well-thought-out response as to what concretely you're doing. But again, the idea is just to make the future more visible, and it's not claiming to represent the future. It's not saying we are the voices of the future. And it's not making decisions for the politicians. It's forcing them to make decisions by not bracketing out other considerations. So I think this should also be accompanied by an independent council for the future. Actually, since I'm in Paris, but also because it's good work, I should mention the work of some French commentators like Dominique Bourg or Pierre Rosanvallon, who've talked about an academy for the future. So it's a similar idea of having historians, intellectuals, social scientists, constitute an independent council for the future, who produce long-term trends, who maybe have visionary explorations about what the future might look like. You know, a future with no cars, or a future with shared housing, or different forms of the city. And they have no decision-making power in my model, but they do have an agending setter power, which is they can specify the sorts of things that the government must address. You know, this is, you know, in political science, one of the key powers is who writes the agenda, and the other one is who writes the minutes. And the point here is just to harness the power of setting the agenda, but no more. So then I don't think there's any democratic worries here or worries about manipulation. And it combats a tendency to ignore long-term trends, and it just makes the future visible again. I'd love to be able to say, and you know, some countries have tried this and we've seen it has positive effects, but I can't say that because no countries have really tried these things. So what I do say is look at the phenomena that lead people not to think about planning for the future in this way. Look at the psychological traits like discounting the future, temptation, weakness of will, procrastination, lack of imagination, and then these institutional proposals are ways of trying to address those. So one of the worries is the future is just not visible because it hasn't happened yet. So this is a way to make it visible, to make it something you can't ignore. Now, I'll end with maybe a more wonk type proposal, which is, it seems to me sometimes that the way political institutions are designed is as if they are designed to encourage short-termism. So if you're trying to encourage short-termism, what you would do is set targets that reward very short-term results but ignore the long-term. And you would have very short audit timetables. You'd say, you must do X, and it must be an immediate benefit, and you must do it in the next year. Charities sometimes do this. So charities in developing countries often say, here's a sum of money. The donors want to see positive results within the next year. I know people, for example, who've worked in villages, and the villagers wanted investment in long-term infrastructure because they could then trade, but the charities wanted short-term, quick results. Now, I think we have similar things with many economic policies. So the solution then is to have indicators that track long-term performance. So having read quite a lot of financial economics and business economics, they also make exactly the same point. And so the idea of a health metric I came across in financial accounting, and it's a very nice metaphor that when you go to a doctor, you don't want the doctor just to know how you feel on that day. You want them to take maybe a cholesterol test for something that at T1 they can measure that will predict your likely health at T10 later on. So you need tests of governance and policy that you can implement now and measure now that are good, reliable predictors of how things are going to be in the future. One thing which I think is sort of similar to this, I mistyped it, is commitment accounting by two climate scientists. So let me give you that to make this a bit more concrete. So Stephen Davis and Sokolow say that if you're trying to audit the construction of an airport, what you shouldn't do is, for the year in which it's built or the years, calculate the emissions for the construction. What you should do is calculate the emissions for the construction and all likely emissions resulting from the construction of that, to which you're already committed by building at T1. And I think this is a way of factoring the lock-in effect. And it means at the point of decision, you don't bracket out all the future things to which you're committing. You measure now, things that you would care about if you cared about the long term. And the second thing you would do, if you were serious about these long-term changes, is change the audit timetable. So this is from two very respectable mainstream political scientists in the UK, David King and Ivor Crewe, who in the UK point out that you often have annual targets in the civil service, or at most you might have 3 yearly budgets. But because of that, you have to deliver in those timetables, and why not channel people's self-interest to the extent people are self-interested, and assess their performance over much longer time frames? Why not even be able to hold people accountable 10, 15, 20 years after they've left office? Why not tie their pensions remuneration to longer-term performance? Now, the point about this is I do think this is something you can do right from here and now. It's not inaccessible. It's perfectly feasible in that sense. It doesn't seem to me immoral or morally problematic. It's not utopian. I'm not saying we should renew human nature and make people not self-interested. It's more like harnessing self-interest to make people think about the long term, and for us, for the energy transition. So in the interest of putting concrete things out there, there are five thoughts about rethinking the way we do politics. And they're supposed to be quite conventional. Right? They're supposed to be ways that look at politics as practice in existing political institutions. I think quite a lot should happen elsewhere and in other forms and for different people. But in a way, what I'm trying to do is talk to policymakers and think, why don't you do this stuff? And why don't we campaign for them to do these things? So let me then turn to my very final one, which is vaguer, but I think is important. So I've said we should have principles, we should have policies, we should have reformed political institutions, which was the bulk of what I wanted to talk about. But I think we need a different kind of political vision, a different kind of political language. And we need to shift away from the way we think of the state at the moment, which is I think we have a proprietary notion of the state, or a private ownership notion of the state, whereas the current manifestation, current government and its citizens have private ownership over natural resources. And they have obligations to other contemporaries, other states. But within that, they can do whatever they want with it. And if you look at analyses of private property, one of the core incidents is the right to destroy. And on this proprietary model, current generations do have a right to destroy quite a lot of their natural resources. This is an exaggeration, right? This is an ideal type to which I think we're broadly conforming. Or to put it in political language, they have a kind of temporal sovereignty. So we often think of sovereignty with respect to other states, and if you're sovereign, you're the highest authority. No one is higher than you, and everyone within your jurisdiction is subordinate to you. But this is what we have intergenerationally. We have the current generation sovereign over its jurisdiction over time, but also vulnerable to the tyranny of what came before. But then we have another model we can draw on, another ideal, which doesn't think of the state as being the private property owner of the resources, but rather it has use rights. And it may use but not destroy. It may have lots of autonomy and self-determination, but there's responsibility. And it doesn't have temporal sovereignty. What might have sovereignty, if it even exists in this realm, is more humanity at large. Now, why do I say this? Well, I just think we're locked into an unhealthy way of thinking about the state, where people think they have the right to do these things. In a way, the political proposals I'm trying to do are trying to move us away from that, to think of the state as not being temporally sovereign, but having a trusteeship relationship with responsibilities to future generations. And therefore, my proposal is a way of trying to bring this more abstract visionary point to concrete fruition. So, yeah, you get the same vision in the Iroquois nations. You may have come across this idea of a seventh generation rule. I don't know if it's familiar to you. The idea is that the Iroquois said you should always think, when making these political decisions, about what 7 generations down would want. Turns out, at least to my experience and investigation, that they didn't say this. But what they did say, I think it came about in the 60s, where people wanted to bestow a legitimacy on it. But what they did say in their sort of constitutional framework was that decision makers should always have in view not only the present, but also the coming generations. And what I'm trying to do is just think through what that really means. So that's it. I've tried to just say, here are 2 principles that should guide our thinking about a clean energy transition. I've floated a proposal. I'd be interested to know whether people think that it's ineffective, undesirable. I floated 5 proposals for political reform to help realize this. I don't think the policies are enough. And I've tried to set this in a broader sort of framework about a rethinking of the concepts that we tend to use, like sovereignty, private ownership, and to shift us away to trusteeship and stewardship. Thank you.
Okay, we have about 25 minutes for discussion. If you raise your hand, I'll call on you. I don't know everybody's name, so please, I apologize if I can't call on you by name. John.
Yeah, okay, 3 points. Just on your final trustee principle, trusteeship, going from private property. I mean, just a very good statement of that is actually Marx. It sounds very similar, yeah. Right? So where Marx says we're usufructuaries, and he says we're not even common owners of the globe at the moment, right? Yeah.
You're thinking of capital.
Capital, yeah, exactly. And it strikes me that it's got a lot. You know, it's almost a statement of what you've got there.
Yeah, it's in my mind when writing it.
Yeah, right. But no, there was 2 other issues that I wanted to raise, which I think are slightly related. One is the focus that you have, and I think implicit that focus isn't there, but you talked about psychological reasons for myopia.
Yeah.
And I just wonder whether, as well as psychological myopia, there's institutional myopia in various ways. So I think about the reports on Exxon Valdez or the Spirit of Free Enterprise accidents, where what happens is you have disasters because of just standard procedures, but the way that people just move through institutions, what you standardly do in institutional procedures. And it seems to me that a lot of what goes on, you can have people who are have a very long-term view, but actually procedurally, the institutions are set up in a way. And I think some of what you're trying to do is addressing that. But I just think introducing that notion of institutional myopia. The more general issue I have is the focus on political institutions. And this is a bit unfair because it's not there, right? But it strikes me, you're writing this at a point where political institutions seem have remarkably fewer and lesser power in the world. Yeah, and so what the relationship between that is and the kind of economic institutions that are also very powerful and the constraints that places on political institutions. And just one final point is there any empirical evidence about all the reforms that have been so far, whether they made any difference whatsoever? Right, has there any been an audit on all of these? You go through all of these, because my suspicion is that they've made very little difference. Yeah.
Okay, good. Yeah, there's a lot in there. I would say there's a slight difference with the Marx passage, because Marx is talking about private ownership of things like resources and the world and natural resources, not about political institutions and the state. But yeah, I take the point. I mean, I love that passage, I think, because it expresses a kind of we'll look back and think how strange it was that we privately owned these things. Yeah, I mean, this was very compressed, but I agree with what you were saying about institutional procedures. I have this long paper where I list 15 type drivers of myopia, and some of them are to do with human nature. Some of them are partly the way we design institutions, and often it's the way they interact. So often we design institutions to counter our failings, but in this case, often they interact in harmful ways. In a way, what I was saying, Proposal 5 was about the institution. You have often good, well-meaning people who would like to think about the long term, but the way we've designed it, it compels them to think about the short term, and it's a sort of a pathology of the institution. There's an example, actually, I know from the UK educational system where you have, as you'll know, but at least sometimes two, maybe 3 levels of school, and they assess children on their value added. You might think that's a great thing, but actually what happens is when they go from 7 till about 12, that school wants to show they've really done very well. But what do you do if you're the next school and you have to show their value added? What you do is you say, you think they were at that level when they came to trust? No, they were more like this level. And then you can show that theirs. And this is what happens. So it's a very common phenomena that kids who do very well are then told, no. And it's an institutionally produced pathology, and I'm sure no one has any harmful thoughts at all about it, but it's a byproduct. And it's, in a way, this is good news because these are things we can change. 2 other quick points. Yeah, I mean, I did say this is very much about politics as normal, but I do think we can learn, we can apply these more widely. So for social movements, for different forms of non-state actor, these are all lessons they can learn about metrics of success, time periods in which we judge, decision-making procedures, building in the agenda. So whenever people are making decisions, I think they can implement this. It's just that I'm speaking at the European Parliament on Monday, and I'm kind of gearing it to people who are thinking about these times. But I think it can be generalized. On evidence, that's a real problem. There's 2 problems here. One is that there are some of these reforms I mentioned, you'll notice some things about them. They're short-lived, right? So Hungary had one, and then Viktor Orban's government kind of watered it down. Israel, they abolished it. The Sustainable Development Commission in the UK lasted 11 years, and then... So some of them are just... they fail the test of sustainability over time. Other ones, the reports you get are written by the people who served on them. So the information I have about the Israeli one is written by Shlomo Shoham, who happened to be the chair of it. So we desperately need information on it. What I can say, though, is there's some quite good political science work comparing countries like the UK, US, Canada and others on long-term planning that show that different structures do predictably come out with different answers and different results. But they weren't doing it from thinking of reforming it. They were just saying, well, why is it that some countries reform their pension schemes and other ones don't? But yeah, political scientists out there, this is something they should work on.
Okay, I have Fabian and Jeremy on the list right now. Let's see. Good.
Thank you very much, Simon. That was highly interesting. I have two questions. One about the policies. So you said that you don't want to talk so much about the global, but more the domestic. And I had the feeling with the Clean Energy Initiative, you actually went to the global in many ways. If you also talk about changing the intellectual property rights regime, that's normally something that you do not only do domestically, but then you have to go further. So I was wondering whether you could give us a bit more insight into what we should do in our respective countries, right? So what the policy proposal there is, because I had the feeling that what you talked about was more really the big picture, if you will. And the second question is whether there's not a lot more we should say about the political vision. So I often have the feeling that as theorists, and because maybe it's easier, we like to talk about institutions. But as you said, there's first the problem of how the institutions are put into practice, right? So then needs to be, for a political party, it needs to make sense to really advocate for the future. And doesn't that have a lot to do maybe with socio-cultural change? So maybe not talking about an egalitarian ethos, but an intergenerational ethos, yeah. Right? And how do you get there? Because I think that's really the bit where we struggle. So if you take a country like Finland, it's great that they have the committee, and it probably does some good things, but it didn't influence their energy choices necessarily in the right way. They went nuclear. And it certainly, with recent political trends in Finland, doesn't look like they're on the right path either. So, you know, and that has something to do with how people feel and think about things. And that might be more a question of ethos and then the institutions.
Yeah. Okay, good. I mean, I'll try and be more succinct than I was. Yeah, I should be clear. So when I talked about I'm focusing not on the global, I meant that purely about the institutional reforms. And I think you're right to pick out that the policy I talked about was a global one. So I do think of I've written stuff on reforming global political processes that try and make them more future friendly, but I didn't want to squeeze them in. I say one link I do think is you're not going to get any global change unless you reform states, because they're just held accountable. And so at the COP, the British representatives will do exactly what number 10 tells them. But you're right, there was a mismatch in my global-local. Question 2 was on the vision and social-cultural ethos. I think that is crucial. The hard thing is knowing what to do about it or how to respond to it. So people often say, well, we should design the educational system to inculcate these virtues, and I'm sure that's right. But often when people talk about these mores, it's with the sense that they're a very important variable, but there's not much we can do to change them. And so actually, Alexis de Tocqueville writes about this in Democracy in America. He says one of the things that makes people think about the future is religion, and they resist temporary temptation to some extent because of the long term. But when I read that, I didn't think, oh, well, great, we should instill religion in people. So I'm at an impasse now, thinking about how the best way to respond to those, other than to say it's crucially important. Maybe education. Maybe I shouldn't be so coy about education. I think, well, that is really where we should put the emphasis. And it's certainly true that educational systems at the moment tend to be very short-term in their value system and orientation. I'll just say one quick thing about the Finnish one. I'm not defending the Finnish one. I just borrow certain notions of it. But one thing they had was the government could choose the topics they work on. So they just chose things that bothered them. I think it might be a different story if they're forced to say what they're going to do about energy and energy not in a geopolitical sense, because Russia was looming large on their thoughts. Yeah, the Finnish record isn't something I particularly want to defend.
Okay. Jérémy, and then I have Conrad and Gordon and Peter. Is it Peter? Sorry? Fergus, thank you.
Thanks very much, Simon. So just some quick comments. Just in terms of the different elements that you elaborated that would make up such an institutional reform, like the Citizens' Day, I'm sorry, I've got the names wrong, the sort of committee for the future and some type of academy. I just wondered whether you had any sense pragmatically of what would, in your view, be the most likely of those elements to make the most difference. Secondly, I'm just wondering why or whether you would consider a more direct popular connection to thinking about the future. So, say instead of having a parliamentary committee, would you consider a referendum type connection between what people want in relation to the future as a way of connecting actual people's deliberations and preferences about the future to the outcomes that are endorsed. And finally, I mean, in terms of selling it, I mean, would you ever consider a sort of a what can the future do for us component? That sounds very counterproductive or at odds with what you're suggesting, but very often a very positive way of selling future-orientated things like this or future-orientated investments. So we have this with the Australian Fund. People often call for, particular type of investments that come out of allocating resources for the future. So with the Australian Pension Fund, people say, well, look, why don't you build trains, train lines, public transport, essential infrastructure. That's both good for the future and generates jobs in a way that investing in the Tokyo Stock Exchange doesn't. So obviously you don't want to tie everything to that, but just as a very pragmatic measure.
Good. Yeah. When you said, would I consider, I mean, I would consider, these are not set, right? I mean, so I was about to say I would consider anything, but then, no, that's not true. But so on the first one, what's most likely? Yeah. So I'll send you the paper I wrote on it, because one thing I kind of argued in the paper was they all kind of hang together. So it's just better to have them as a package. But then you might say, well, tough, you can't have that, which one? But let me say why they hang as a package. So, for example, the Independent Council for the Future, Britain had something like this, but it could be ignored, completely ignored. I thought, well, we'll tweak it by relating it, so this thing about setting the agenda which the government must respond to, actually enhances its power, but then if you tie that to my other proposal, this works best when you have someone else saying, what are you going to do about climate change? What are you going to do about pension reform? So I mentioned pension just because the experts in this knew that we're going to have this pension problem because of the demographic transition. They knew it was going to happen, but politicians could ignore it. So pitch one is just the holistic, but I mean, I don't know which one I would go for if I have to. It's like if I were on Desert Island Disc, what would be the? I guess the first. I guess forcing the government to actually confront it, and then civil society actors can take over and do a lot of the rest, and they can say, "Well, I don't think that's going to work." But I hadn't, thought about it in that way, which maybe I should do. More direct referendum, I mean, I've kind of I've been tempted to do something a bit like this with crowdsourcing and agendas. So you might think, like the Icelandic government eventually ignored this, but they used crowdsourcing to get suggestions for their new constitution. That's not what you suggested. You meant a referendum, but and I wondered, why not have those fed up? You could do that. I'm not averse to a referendum. I'd like to know whether you think it would have advantages over it. But yeah, I'll think about it. I mean, my criteria, as I say, are effectiveness, legitimacy. Can we get from here to there, and would it be abolished or rendered ineffective? I suppose the one thing I will say, maybe these things are slightly context dependent, or they will be. So some things might. Maybe there are countries which have traditions of referendums, and it's just a lot easier to get that in. So maybe I just can't give a universal answer to that. And the final one, I totally agree on what the future can do for us. In a way, many of the forces that promote myopia are just harmful now. So the domination of fossil fuel companies over politics is bad for the present and disastrous for the future. So many of these are not, should we prioritize the future over the present? But saying we're going to invest these for the future and you can have some say over which direction. But there is another one which is maybe slightly more ethereal, where I think people care about what others think about them. And so to be slightly fanciful, think of A Christmas Carol, think of Scrooge. The transformation in his life was when he went and he heard what people were saying about him after he died, and they didn't. The businessmen he dealt with didn't care, and the other people said, "Thank goodness we can steal from him." And you might say to people, is that how you want your kids, your grandchildren's generation? Is that how you want to go down in history? It may not loom large in people's thoughts, but I think it matters a bit. Incidentally, I should give total credit for that to a conservative politician, David Willits, in his book The Pinch, who uses the Scrooge metaphor, and I think, that's quite a powerful way. But I know you meant a more kind of down to earth, but we could try both.
Okay, we have 3 questions in 6 minutes, so if I could ask you to keep your questions and your answers short, that would be helpful. Conrad is next.
Okay. You said 2 or 3 sentences, which are very short but far-reaching in their consequences. I want to comment on that. And you said that Britain has the 5th largest GDP worldwide. Are you hearing me? You said Britain has the 5th largest GDP worldwide, but people have pretty arduous lives, and that's why no one would be willing to reduce energy consumption. I think there's a couple of premises in that sentences which I cannot agree with, and I just want to voice my critics here. First, there's a premise that a high GDP equals a high quality of life, and there's a whole branch of degrowth literature which challenged that assumption for many years. Secondly, there's the assumption that everyone consumes the same amount of energy, which is obviously not the case. And there's the assumption that a reduction in total energy consumption would necessarily have to increase energy poverty. But I think if you put it up like this, the argument is really under-complex, because obviously it's different groups of the population that have different energy consumptions. So I think it's quite possible to have a reduced energy consumption and still have less energy poverty. So I think it's really not helping the discussion very much.
Can he respond to you and then?
Okay. I wanted to be brief. Yeah.
I just want to say I totally agree with what you say. I think there's a difference between the reality of would reductions make people's lives reduction in the aggregate make people's lives on aggregate go better or worse. I think their lives will be much better, but they don't perceive it as such. They would resist the policies that need to be enacted. So I'm with the Mill Keynes view about what makes a life go well. But I'm talking about what's politically possible. So I think the tragedy, as I said yesterday, is partly that if you had tough mitigation targets, people's quality of life would dramatically increase. I don't assume that consumption is the same. I don't assume that if you reduced aggregate energy use, that people's lives would go worse. What I assume is politically, it's not a starter to say to people, let's do this. I would love it if it turned out that I was incorrect on there. But think about how things get reported when petrol prices go up. It's reported as a disaster, and says car users across the country. So if I'm talking about the gap between the reality of their well-being and the perception about what's politically desirable. So I'm saying it's politically, there's a huge obstacle. So I'm not making those assumptions.
Yeah.
Okay.
Did you were you continuing? I interrupted you, so can you continue,
maybe,
but briefly, please?
Yeah, maybe I'm seeing from a sociological point of view. I think it's really, as a sociologist, I don't want to say the people want this or that. I think society is much more complex than this. But okay, we agree on this. Obviously, there is this political reality of a certain reaction, but I think as scientists we can go beyond that. I think we can say a reduction of consumption can be distributed in a certain way, and that makes a whole difference if it's resisted and by whom it is resisted. I think we could have that complexity in the argument. But we have the 6 minutes, so I think we leave it for later discussion.
Did you want to respond? Or?
I work in a politics department. I'm just impressed by the power of elites to control these things, and hope you were right.
Gordon.
Yeah, I have a lot of sympathy with the broad sort of thrust of your argument, Simon, but when you were talking about extending the period of audits and also the idea of future of pensions being dependent on performance over a longer time period, I mean, if you're arguing that reducing energy consumption is not politically feasible, I'm not sure that one is politically feasible. But anyway, that's not the point, in fact. What it was making me think about was Rosa's work on social acceleration, which he described as a sort of theory of modernity. And the argument there is that the world is accelerating in all sorts of ways. The speed of social and technological change and so on is accelerating. And that's actually enormously important for the capacity of such mechanisms, and including the one that's up there on the screen, to have any sense of what the future might well be like. Yeah. And I often find that with policymakers who just throw their hands up at the idea that they can think about what the world will be in 10, 20, 30 years' time, because there's this sense of these sort of forces of change which are nothing to do with them, that are going to overcome their capacity to imagine the future in any sense at all. And it's very particularly intriguing when you think about the sort of world of climate change modelling. It's a doddle to model the climate in 50 years' time, model the social world in 50 years' time. Nobody would attempt to do it. And people in the Department of Energy and Climate Change who sort of talk about their sort of future strategies completely acknowledge that they have no sense of the sort of processes of social and technological change which might well really play out alongside changes in climate. So I think the basic question is to do with the speed of change and how that relates to the sort of future thinking you're advocating.
Yeah, but I worry about this a lot. Not that I know the social acceleration literature, but I think anecdotally about when I was a graduate student, there was one computer that we all went to once a day to have this email thing. And so it's an absolutely alien world. So the two thoughts I think I have about this is, well, one upshot of this is just to reinforce exactly that vision that you claim that you're setting in place good things for Britain in the future. You have no idea what you're talking about, and that epistemic modesty, might then inform policies. It might make us worry about lock-in effects. The second thing is my hunch, and from reading a bit of the political science literature on it, but I wonder whether the lesson then is we should focus much more on institutional resilience and robustness in the future, because you think, well, we can't know the nature of the problems and challenges and opportunities, but we do know these institutions cope better with those, so maybe that's the lesson. And just to tie it into the history of political thought, some people like Edmund Burke actually wrote about what we should do for the future, and I'm not a remotely conservative, but one of the interesting things he thought was our legacy to future generations was to leave functioning political institutions in place. I mean, he had a totally conservative view of that, but I think he's right that we can't think of it in terms of leaving money or resources or wealth purely. We also have to think about, are we leaving institutions in place that are well equipped? But that's as far as I've got, and maybe that's as far as one can get. So epistemic humility and trying to think of resilient, flexible institutions.
Fergus.
Thank you. I've just got a few very quick, small comments and then one slightly larger one. First, on the core principles, you mentioned just burden sharing. But I think you should add kind of just benefit sharing as well. It kind of relates to a point I was making yesterday. But I think the best indications we have are that there are going to be enormous benefits as well as costs. So there's a distribution question, but thinking about how the benefits are going to be shared, and I can try and talk to you more about that maybe afterwards because I know we're limited on time. But how we share the bounty, I think, is incredibly important from the transition. And also as a right to energy. So I really like the work that you've done, like in just emissions and kind of getting away from the distribution of green. I think those are great, and I know so you're on the right. I'm completely with you on that. But I think even you can go even further in not just a right to energy, but actually it's a right to energy services, and that provides a useful wedge between energy per se and the kind of closer to the functionings that we care about. And there's some interesting economic historic work. I don't know if you come across Roger Fouquet's work that looks at the relationship between energy prices over the long run and energy service prices. But basically energy prices can go up a lot, but energy services come down because efficiency goes up. And so I think that's really important in this transition, and it relates to the energy efficiency kind of stuff. Quickly on the Australian Future Fund, I'm not sure you might not want to use that as an example, just because when you said that, I was thinking that there's been quite a lot of controversy about the Future Fund's investment in fossil fuels, and I just did a quick Google to see what the latest is, and actually just this month, here are a couple of headlines from Australia. So Peter Costello is the chairman of the Future Fund. He's the former Conservative treasurer under John Howard, and he's the chairman of the Future Fund. From the Financial Review this month, Peter Costello says Future Fund won't join fossil fuel divestment. And from the Australian, Future Fund, Peter Costello pins hopes on fossil fuels. So just be wary of that. And then my larger point is, I think there's a lot of really great ideas in there, but the way the paper was set out, they don't seem to kind of all connect to one another or sort of be in the right order. So there was the point about the kind of the innovation fund, which I think is really interesting, and I'm glad you're exploring that model. And then the policies, and then at the end was the vision. But the vision, maybe I didn't quite get it, but that seemed to me like quite a strong institutional change in the property regime. And so I sort of wonder how it all hangs together. And I mean, I would have thought the vision would come first, and then the principles, the institutions, and the policies, or. So there's sort of an ordering, sequencing, and how it all hangs together. I'm not quite that I can't quite see, but there's some great ideas in there. So thanks very much.
Yeah, no, thank you. I'll be brief because you're right about on the burden sharing. I'm just trying to be very quick, but you're right. It's about the fair sharing of burdens and benefits. I'll say one thing. I mean, these weren't things I was endorsing. I'm just saying these are things that are out there that people have proposed, but actually in many of these things I'm critical. So I'm not holding up the Australian Future Fund as a model. Just FYI. But also, even if it didn't have those things, it's very restrictive, right? It's just about one particular thing, which is the pensions, I think, of public sector workers. But I'm also sceptical about, number one up there, and the things like reforming. But on the sequencing, I mean, I have to think about it. But the way I thought about it is, well, what would be a fair approach? So we need the principles, and then, well, how do we do that? So that's the policy. What would we put in place? And then we can't just come up with policies. We need to think what institutions are receptive to these kinds of ideas. But maybe the vision thing should come earlier. But then I find it's kind of, my worry about it is I think it's really important, but it's at a vague but deep level. So I think it's about the way we even think about the world. We think in terms of sovereignty, temporal sovereignty, and so it's just trying to dig deeper at the end. But maybe that should come earlier on. And I was worried I'd lose people. They think, oh, he's off on this flaky stuff, and oh, he quoted the Iroquois, and it's terrible. I'm just going to plug my ear. So get a bit of justice in there, a bit of policy, and then. But I take the point. But there was a plan. That's what I'm trying to say. There's always a plan. There's a structure.
All right, I think we have to stop now. Would you join me, please, in thanking Simon?
Well, thank you all very much.